Karmenlara and Camilla Eeg-Tverbakk. They are both connected, as most of you probably know, to the Theatre Academy of Fredrikstad. Karmenlara as an artistic director and associate professor still, right? And Camilla as a PhD connected to the institution, but also been teaching there for several years before that. From my perspective, Karmenlara and Camilla representing a tradition or a breakout tradition that we superficially can say started in the 60s. So to put this interview in a context, I would like to talk a bit about the development of theater, art and artistic research the last 50 years. Yesterday I mentioned the evolution of realism and naturalism in the break of 19th till 20th century. That period also created what we call the modern theater, with very separated professions. You had a writer that wrote the dramatic text, you had a director that made an interpretation of this text, and then you had an actor that embodied the director's interpretation and vision on stage. It's important to note that this is a modern invention. Theater has been made in many different ways during history. So what happened after World War more and more, and accelerated in the 60s, is that this way of working got more and more challenged, and also the kind of ideological foundation for it, and aesthetics. Several theater makers started to work with aesthetics where the text not forcingly would be the primary source for the way of thinking or working, like for instance Jerzy Grotowski, later Robert Wilson and so on. Then there would also be a wave of group theater making, where the performance and aesthetics would be created of a community, for instance. And finally, also questions like gender and politics and so on got more and more important for the theater makers, and also changed the aesthetics and ideology of theater. But furthermore, artists from other fields than theater started to create performances. The rise of performance art started to influence the field of theater already in the 60s. And I think we can say that this is a process that is still going on. Many of the artists from visual art field also move from the visual art field to theater. With this also terms from visual art, like site-specific art became site-specific theater, and we're talking about conceptual art as well in theater as we do in visual art now. So these terms has been today a natural part of the discourse of theater. The traditional theater space itself also got changed. The theater room, with a clear separation between the stage and where the audience is sitting, this separation got problematized. The visual art field have, as you maybe know, the term white cube to describe the empty gallery with white walls. It's like a blank slate where you put something in, and what you put in there can be perceived as art or discussed as art. The theater got the black box, which is or like kind of blank slates where there is the room itself doesn't communicate where the audience should be or where the performance should be, even though there still, of course, are a lot of traditions of this also. But anyway, the idea was this blank slate, this room that can be whatever. Whatever, if you put something in there, it become a performer. If you can move the audience, you don't know who is, you don't forcingly need to know who is audience and performer and so on. So it was a way to also try to get rid of some predefined ideas about what theater is. At the same time, as these processes went on in the field of art, theater science and performative studies developed in universities in both US and Europe. This was studies, university studies, that try to coin what is specific about theater and performance art. What is it that separates these fields from other art fields? It used to be a tendency before these studies to, for instance, focus on the text very much when you talked about theater and drama in university studies. So from many of these studies, it came a new generation of also performance artists that often came with another intellectual approach to theater field, another awareness. They were critical, they were experimental. And often theater artists that both could write, they directed and they acted in their own performances. This is a new structure was tested out as well. The field of theater art started to use new words and separations between institutionalized theaters and what would be called experimental or the free field, or what is going on outside of the institutions. So this was a process, this separation was a process that was going on in most of Western countries. In Norway, the Academy of Theatre in Oslo, where you are now, is an acting education that is representing somehow the institutions. Over many years, this school has considered it as its most important task to educate actors for the big theatre institutions. That has been like the task. Even the last performance has been called the sales performance. That's been the name of the last performance on this school for many years. Norwegian Theatre Academy of Fredrikstad was established in 1996, first as a pilot project for puppetry. But it soon developed to be an education that aimed to be international oriented, experimental, and focused on the performer as a creator. So while more traditional theatre schools like this in Oslo would, for instance, normally say they are educating actors, I think Fredrikstad would more probably often say they are educating performers, for instance. So before we start to talk about your specific work, this is just to give a kind of background from the work and so on. Before we start to talk about the work, I just wonder if you want to add something, Camilla, about the education and say where you are now.
Yeah, thank you very much for that introduction. You're very good at these contextualizations. Thank you very much. Yeah, I think it's correct that we are concerned with the broad field of performance, but we still talk about educating actors. And I think that's actually really important that we clarify that, because we're hoping to, and I think we are, expanding the definition of acting and who an actor can be. So just to challenge that a bit, yes, we draw from the fields of performance studies, performance art, and visual arts, and of course, you know, sort of challenging even within that the conventions of the white box or the black box. So I would argue that although we have inherited some of the tradition of the post-dramatic or the postmodern, that we're also really concerned with even challenging those conventions, which have within them certain, I would say, certain classist or even racist principles as well. So we're constantly questioning what becomes a powerful tradition that dominates. We question that throughout all of our processes, and that's because we're curious about each generation's new perspectives on theater practice. So we're not just a top-down education which says, here, this is how it's done, do what we do, but actually saying these are some strategies that come from the field, these are some of the questions we have, and this is how we do some of this. What do you think? And then to see through the students' work, their independent productions, which are a really important part of their education, proposals for how they bring together the rigors of the dance field, the visual arts field, the sound arts, sound art is actually really important, I feel, in our practice and education, because the senses are a crucial part of our training process. Engaging with all of the senses, not just the actor senses, but the senses of the public, and the questioning what the relationship between theater practice and experience is. So it's not just about ideas and sort of trying to translate ideas to a public through theater, but actually what's happening right now in time together. How can we play with time together? And as we talked about with Per yesterday in the discussion, this notion of dreaming together, which is not about escaping into a theatrical reality which is not in the room, but actually expanding the definition of the reality that's happening in the room. So through scenography and acting, which work very closely together, we feel that we open up a lot of opportunity for what it means to be human, also what it means to not be human, to be a thing, which Camilla will talk about a bit, and to respond to all of the different elements of the theater process as potentially equal, which means, again, that we're not looking to a director to always set the tone, although we do work with directors. And it's an interesting challenge for our students to have a director come in with a very strong vision and find out how they bring their different ideologies and methodologies to a singular vision. And that's really interesting for the process as well. Of course, there's a lot more I could say, but maybe you want to add something to that? No?
I think I would love to talk more about this, but I think maybe we can save it for the discussion after the panel, because the discussion about the institution and what is the institution, what is free field, and does it exist, and which way does it exist. So I think we can save that for later.
I can add one thing, which is I just want to say also that I didn't only teach before at the Academy. I was the artistic director before Karmenlara, and I'm saying that because I know the institution from the inside, and my research is also coming out of that environment, and that's really important. But I think maybe also to say that our pedagogy is always evolving, because we are concerned with this relationship between theory and practice, which is about the connection between art and the sort of reality outside art, including politics. So we are constantly trying to sniff out what's going on and how that can influence the teaching.
So it's of course important when you talk about the way you're teaching as well, but I would love to save some of this material later. Because you are here also to give a workshop, and I would love to talk with you a bit about how you work. And you have recently published a book that is called Responsive Listening, which is theatre training for contemporary spaces, published by the school, and you too?
By Brooklyn Arts Press.
Yeah.
And by us.
But you are the editors.
Yes, that's right.
And also have one article from both of you in this book, which was very clarifying actually. So I recommend this for the ones that is interested. To start with you, Camilla. Your essay is called On Plain Text. An important reference point for you seemed to be object-oriented philosophy and new materialism. And before we go into details, I think it can be clarifying if you just explain to us what does that mean.
Oh, that's really hard.
Just try to think.
Do you have the rest of the day?
Your students.
Well, I'm trying to figure out what it is, and it seems like the philosophers who are writing are also trying to figure out what it is. I mean, it's a very new strand of thinking, and my tutors are saying I'm not even allowed to use big letters on object-oriented ontology because it's not really a direction yet. And there are like a couple of writers, philosophers writing in this, and they're all sort of have different ideas of what it is, and they're discussing. But for me, and how I'm not trying to write about this philosophy, I'm trying to use it to give me ideas to think about theater practice. So what I'm using from it is the idea that everything is materiality, including our bodies. A thought is a thing, everything is a thing. And the idea of a thing is that it always has a surface that we can see, but it also always has something withdrawn, something within it that we cannot grasp. So there is always a known and an unknown. And I'm using this in relation to text work, thinking about the text material as a thing. So there is all, you know, as a way also to get away from interpretation, actually, and the idea that the things around us, which there's an equality. It's about questioning anthropomorphism, which is where the humans are on the top of a hierarchy in the world, you know, have the power of definition. This whole theory is questioning that. It's sort of trying to put the humans down on the level with everything else, because we are things like everything else are things. And how do we relate? So relation is very important here, and the codependency between things, which means that we also have to realize that we codepend on this chair is supporting me. You know, what is my relationship to this chair? I'm dependent, you know, how we are dependent on things, and how things form us and our thinking as much as we form them. So there's a lot of stuff around this. I don't know if any of the philosophers would say that I have a good explanation of OOO or object-oriented philosophy, but it's in this landscape.
And for me, what is also interesting about this starting point is, if I should make a very simplified interpretation, it's also like philosophy story has always been like through the perception of humans, right? Mm-hmm. It's always like what do we see and what do we observe, but here it's like, okay, so it actually do exist without our observation. We are also things like the chair.
Yeah, and also how we are caught in conceptions of how we define things. We put words on it, and by that we frame it, and you know, and by framing it with language, we also take away our own possibility to actually perceive the thing as a whole. We can never perceive anything like a whole, so it's also to understand that our idea of reality is a fiction in a sense. We cannot grasp reality. Reality is withdrawn for us.
So the most important thing here is the shift of how you see the relationship between humans and the objects or the world. So this change of perception, how do you then use that in the training?
Yeah.
In the work?
Well, it's like I said, it's to try to relate. I mean, relation is a very important aspect, and I'm thinking at the moment that maybe it could be an idea, because in the theater we talk so much about presence. We're very concerned with presence, and I'm wondering if we could maybe exchange the word presence with relation, so that the focus is constantly on relating, both, you know, to the space, to the people, to the text. And what is a relation? It's never stable. It's always something that changes and moves, and you have to constantly be in relation. It's a very active place to be. You have to sense all the time. Listen with your ears, but also sense with your whole sensory apparatus. You know, what am I feeling? How am my body's reaction to what I'm saying, to this situation? What am I actually saying right now? Because with this idea of the text as a thing, it will never mean the same thing, you know, from one moment to the next. So you constantly have to figure out what is this saying now. And I'm working with an idea that I'm putting as I speak, I put the text out in the space. So I'm trying to create a distance between myself and the text, because relation needs a space where you can relate. And sometimes that space is really small, so you feel that the material is really close to you. Other times you cannot really reach it. It's like I cannot, you know, it's too far today. And it's about acknowledging that and accepting that and working with that. So the idea is to speak and listen back at what you're saying, and almost putting the text out there as a question to the audience, as a sharing, and saying, what is this? Because I can never grasp the full meaning of a word or a text, so I need help. So I put it out there, and together with the audience we can explore the various possible meanings in the moment of what's being said. So I'm talking about freeing the text, I'm talking about there's again this idea of putting yourself down, the power relationship between you and the material, that I'm actually trying to relate and accept the text as something in itself that has its own power, its own agency. It wants to do something. It wants to express something that I cannot know and I cannot control. So it's also about letting go of control, which is then in the next step to avoid too much interpretation beforehand, deciding what it means or deciding what I should feel or think around it. So it's a very active relationship.
I would just add that it's really crucial to the practice, and this is something we share when we're teaching, that the listening is an important preparatory skill. And maybe you want to say something about that just to add to it, because I think it's crucial to what you're saying.
Yeah, I do a lot of listening exercises before we start working with text usually, and continue to do that. I mean, of course it becomes a practice in a way, something you need to practice to get good at, because it's difficult to listen. And I mean, we're both referring a lot to Jean-Luc Nancy, the French philosopher, who has a beautiful little book called Listening. And listening is about, I mean, he says listening is about being penetrated. And we have to remember that our bodies and our skin is totally perforated, full of holes. So things can come in and things go out. And that is also part of the exchange. So it's not only a listening with the ears, it's a sensing. So the listening exercises and practices sensory work.
What then is, because if I would have acting teachers here from almost whatever, no matter how dogmatic the tradition would be, they would say listening is very important.
Yeah.
So what is the difference, do you think, if there is a difference? When you say listening in this context and you say it in the most...
I don't know if there's a difference really. We've been talking many times about how we all have different sort of methods and words and what we do, but we're actually pretty much doing the same things. But I think the difference again is how we speak about it, and for me the idea of the text as an object in the way I tried to explain, then the listening becomes a different kind of relationship. I mean, yes, you should always listen to what you're saying on stage, but here the listening is about, again, trying to figure out the relationship and how it's different today than what it was yesterday, for instance, and looking for the difference instead of looking for the known, you're looking for the unknown.
Yes.
I would just add to that. I actually do think there's a difference maybe in the value, the way in which what you're listening for is valued, or also the kind of focus the listening has. I think because it's not only about listening, focusing your listening in, or focusing your listening on a particular event or another person or a situation, but actually the strategy is really this full-bodied sensory listening to the whole space, and there's a kind of musicality to that, which a jazz musician also has, an awareness of all of the different tones and rhythms and potentials within an environment. So it's a listening with maybe not a kind of not a project behind it. Like I'm not listening to look for X. It's a listening being.
Yeah, I can also add.
Just talking about listening, I just got a sign here that you don't need to talk salt.
It's too much. Okay.
But it's fine. It's just having it in
Yes. Okay. Sorry. I just add to that this it's also questioning the whole idea of subjectivity and the I and me as the ruler of the space. You know, you really have to step back and not want so much, maybe. But I just want to quote also again Nancy in relation to listening. He speaks about formal listening that he calls stretching the ear, and he says it implies intensification, concern, curiosity, and anxiety. And there is something about, in this whole word, also about care, about caring for, and what does that mean? I'm using an Italian philosopher called Silvia Benz, who speaks about the tenderness in our encounter with things. Yeah, so there's a lot of stuff onto this.
And it was also, I was also, you know, I watched the workshop yesterday for a couple hours, and it seems like this focus on what is happening here now with the actor and with the listener can make something happen which you don't know what, right? So it's like unpredictable. So does this mean that this way of working, the method in itself, or the way you're moving forward, does then, it's a kind of underlying criticism of a working process where you have to do the same thing on each performance, for instance? Because that's also aesthetical questions, if you understand what I mean. I mean, when you're gonna put up a theatre play, and that's the emotional scene, that's the turning point of the scene, and it has to happen there in that scene.
Yeah.
Then that's one way of thinking.
Yeah.
Is it possible to think both here, or do they exclude each other?
I think maybe they exclude each other.
Okay.
I don't know. We can test it out. But of course, it also creates an aesthetic. And for me, this is my research, so it grows out of my interests. And I just find it really interesting to use the theater space as a space for the unknown and the unplanned and those risks, because it's actually a pretty safe space in society, you know. There are many other spaces where I wouldn't want that unpredictability and uncertainty to take place as much. But here I think we can really use this space to try out things in the live with the audience. That makes it interesting to me. So I'm interested in the less planned. But of course it's a challenge when you have to rehearse and you have to repeat things.
It's an interesting question whether this is also a question about the ideology, aesthetics, and so on. Karmenlara, I just also want to, your article is called Yielding to the Unknown, Actor Training as Intensification of the Senses. And your work seems to be very oriented also around what you call research-based practices. You write about the actor without the master, responsible for researching, choosing, and experimenting. Is this also kind of a opposition position? What do you say?
Maybe it results in being an opposition. It's not a in-your-face opposition. It's not an attack on the history of methods or master teachers who we've all had mentors in very influential, important, powerful ways to do things that have informed us. But for me, it's about acknowledgement of the actor as a creator, as an artist with responsibility, with accountability, and also with a world and the potential to even within a very structured, let's say even classical environment, to challenge and bring new potentials and new possibilities to a tradition or to a canon. So, I mean, if we think about it just in terms of the issue of gender and desire, what it means to be a woman performing on stage and what I should desire, what society or what the history of that stage has expected me to look like and desire and perform like with the same text for 60 years. You know, there's whatever method we're using, we inherently research and challenge that. And I'm taking it a bit further and suggesting that maybe we also can move away from these corsets of tradition and be willing to actually rewrite what it means to be, for example, a woman on stage, not just in performance art, but in theater, with text.
Yeah, because if I would say your text somehow and also your work, my impression is like the starting point is a now acceptance of a situation where the I is fragmented.
Yeah.
We don't have the answer. We don't know. You say one place you say about education, there is no single correct unified I the education is trying to serve or produce, but rather asks students to remain in question throughout a rigorous practice of tangible and practical seeking. So it's like, you know, the starting point itself is like, okay, it's destroyed. So what do we do now? Where do we go now? So where do we go now? How do we do research in a way that gives us some kind of, if not tool, because that's also a problematic word here.
Well, I think that the research model is really useful because research is it's a situation where you pose clear questions and you set up frames for the research of those questions, or principles, like an improvisation. It's not just whatever, just do whatever. I mean, you're setting up time-based situations, whether it's literally on the floor in your work or for a longer period where you're exploring certain issues with certain elements in the space or in the research, like Camilla with her philosophy and the practice of text. So I think the research as a frame, as a way of thinking, allows us also to say, oh, well, that didn't work. I'm going to try something different. And it allows us to change and evolve and transform. And one of the things that actors bring to a practice space, I think, is the right to change, the right to transform, the right to become something else. I mean, that's what the history of theater has given us globally, but we can continue to take that right to transform further, what it means to change and transform, and also to be wrong and try again, and to look back and actually say, we don't agree with something we did yesterday. And there's a crisis aspect to research. But there's always a crisis aspect to being. And what I think is interesting about being a part of the NTA education is that crisis in process is something that our students become familiar with, so that when they meet it in the quote-unquote real world, it's not the first time.
But does this mean that, okay, that's good. Does this mean you get up in the morning and you're going to go to school today and like, what am I going to teach today? We'll find out. How much of a research is also your pedagogical strategies, if you understand what I mean? Yeah. I mean, this is
well, do you want to? Yeah. Okay. Well, on the larger scale, we're planning the curriculum of the education. For the most part, we give ourselves 6 months to a year planning, and we're responding to the field and the questions of the faculty within the research so that it evolves and changes. And there are even some smaller units and aspects that can change quite radically at the last minute according to like, oh wow, look what's happening here, let's do this. But there's many different structures based on experience, which is based on the experience of practicing artists that are coming to work at the academy, and that the guest artists as well as us within the field who are there regularly. So the artistic research process isn't something that we have invented, and it's certainly not something that has no system to it.
There are some things you keep and you still go on working with, and that you've worked with for the last 10 years, and
absolutely,
and continue to explore. And
but when you meet a student, or you meet a new group, or you meet a new teacher, you have to reframe your expectations all the time. And when we find this, you don't just go in saying, I'm only looking for this result, and when I get it, then I'll be happy. I don't do that with the students, and I don't think they do that with each other or with the teachers, although we certainly run into disappointments. I mean, that's part
I've saw a little bit yesterday, but I've also seen it before, and I would say that also from my interpretation, you're also interested in see how meaning are created in the room.
Meaning?
Yeah. How do we create meaning? How do we relate to a situation now, and what do we do with it? For me, it seems like you give exercises, if I should say so, that makes the student try out and see, okay, what kind of meaning is produced from this exercise, and what is given from this, for instance.
I think I would agree with that, except I wouldn't use the word meaning. I would use the word what kind of experience, and partly because for me personally, and this is just my obsession, I'm actually really interested in the resistance of knowledge. I'm interested in, I wrote about this, but it's, and this is one of the problems I probably raise with a lot of people that I talk with, colleagues, but that to kind of resist codifying something into a system. So meaning for me is maybe a word I struggle with a bit, but to confront experience and then out of experience to create reflections, which means actually to be good at describing what happened. And that means being able to describe your sensory experience, which is different than translating it to this means this or this means that. Certainly we do that, but if we can train ourselves to actually describe experience and be more in touch with that, we expand our ways of perceiving, and we don't just reduce something immediately to its value in meaning.
Yeah.
I think I'm also concerned with this, typical notion of meaning production, which we could talk about interpretation as well from the side of the audience, for instance, as well as the performers and people who's been involved in making something. And for me, it's again, in this particular research I'm doing, is also to acknowledge exactly how meaning production happens through the encounter between everything. That's, it's the connections between things that seem not to connect. It's all these things that we deal with that we don't even see or even consider. We just take them for granted. But they are also part of the picture. And that is exactly how you cannot control the meaning production. You cannot know, so you have to let go as a maker, as the one who's making the artwork. You have to let go of controlling the meaning making or the meaning production of something, because you can't.
I'm curious to hear if there are any questions, or yes?
Yeah, I'm just curious, because you say that you work with the resistance of knowledge, and that you always want students to keep moving and researching and finding new things. So I'm therefore then curious to see, do you still keep a hierarchy of the teacher and the students, or do you work on kind of the same level because you're all researching the same thing? If you're finding something new within the field, you might not be able to say, I've got this knowledge, I'm giving it to the students. You need to find it together, or how does that work?
Do you think you have a knowledge that you give to the students?
I think that it depends on the topics, and it depends on the context.
Yep.
We're concerned that they are familiar with the vocabulary and the various strategies and methodologies of the artists in the field, and it is a form of knowledge that's transmitted, but it's not the object of the education. So the object isn't to say, okay, now we've downloaded all the knowledge, now go do what we do. But to say, okay, here are some strategies, and I'm still talking too close.
No, I think it's good.
But once that transmission is taking place, then there's another focus or another interest, which is what work comes out of it. I think we're very concerned at the Academy with the work that students are making, whether it's together with their directors and teachers or on their own. And then once the work starts to evolve and become alive in the room, then it's a conversation, and that conversation can be a lively debate. Sometimes can feel very hierarchical if that's the moment that we're in, but it moves. It's not a static relation, and we're not utopian at all. That's not the effort. It's just more that the work itself creates different kind of problems with different solutions. Yeah.
I think it depends on what you teach. Certainly there are classes that are definitely, here is what you need to learn, especially like in movement and voice work and stuff like that. I know for my own sake that I've been teaching this stuff which I've been researching for the last 4 years, which is obviously very fresh and unstructured, and I say often to the students, you know, I don't know, you know, help me. Let's figure it out. Let's try and see, and I use them as guinea pigs, and then I learn more, and that's really good.
Yeah. Shoot. Yes.
I was just wondering where the audience is in all this. Is the audience also one of the things in the room? And when you say resistance of knowledge, what about the audience's knowledge? And what about the audience's thinking of what is happening in the room?
It's the audience.
If I take the first with the thing.
Take the first with the thing.
Yes, audiences are also things, and that's what's make them equal with me as a performer. I mean, we're equal, and we're equally together exploring the material. So the hope is that to find a way to make that clearer. I mean, that always is the case, I guess. You know, we always want that. But to find ways to make that even more clear, because my experience is also from, you know, a long tradition of Western art that audiences think they need to see what the artist meant or what the artist's intention is. So they're seeking and sometimes feel really stupid because they can't find it and so on. So trying to find ways to make audiences feel part of this on equal terms. That was an answer.
It's such a great question. It's really important. And I think we talk quite a lot about audiences in our education and about audience as co-creator, and that becomes a really problematic and difficult topic a lot because it's not about making work always with audience participation, right? No, it's just that we have a concern, first of all, where are they in the room? So it's not just assumed that they are watching a television on stage, a televisual setup. For example, just thinking about the space, immediately we think about how do we care for the people who enter, where do they go, what happens in time. And from there, a lot of discussions unfold about the role of an audience in the work. But it's a big part of what we discuss in our education. And different workshops and different approaches bring up different questions about audiences. And actually, it's a hot topic for us because there are a lot of different ways which we approach that, and a lot of questions about knowing what's going on, right? And so knowledge is I talk about resisting it, but that doesn't mean that the whole education is resisting it. It's my interest. I'm curious about how we can deal with experience in time and not try to resolve something as a fact.
I just wonder, how do you prepare audience for such experience if they are also trained to look for the meaning of the artist's whole idea? And I have often experienced that audience, they get very intimidated or afraid when they do not understand the meaning.
Can I'll take this, maybe you have something out there. I can tell you that I have, just as an audience member myself, and I refer to that, seeing as much theater as I have seen, a performance, that I go through different levels of alienation as an audience equally in so-called classical or sort of traditional work as I do in experimental work. And it's all about whether or not my presence has been considered in the space. So I wouldn't generalize that I wouldn't assume too much about audiences. I wouldn't assume that what they're looking for or how ready or unready they are for different experiences, but I would assume that they need to, their bodies in space need to be considered. So if I'm sitting in a cold, dark room way far away from talking heads that don't move for 2 hours, and it's cold and kind of dark, and they're using text that's not connected to anything in the room or to their body, for me personally, I'm just completely alienated. So that's my experience. So, and I can't translate to another's experience because the text might have another meaning for another person, and being cold also. So I think it's just that we take risks and we don't expect every audience to get it or like it, and it's not about putting ourselves up here and saying, let's find an audience who can approve of and make what we're doing valuable for us. It's a sharing and a risk all the time.
I also think that this mirrors the contemporary times. I think audience today, how everything works much more fragmented and different kind of medias. Well, I think it's not a total foreign idea culturally either. And also I think the aesthetics that thinking this way creates. I mean, sometimes it's successful and sometimes not, but that it does also create a different kind of aesthetics that you can read. I think. I hope.
Great. Thank you, both of you. I think we should take a break and then come back for a small discussion. Yes?